Hello, everyone, and welcome back to People Jew Want to Know podcast. Today's episode is a very intellectual one where I learned a tremendous amount featuring Samuel J. Hyde. Samuel is a South African-born Israeli intellectual and writer focusing on Israel and the Middle East. He currently lives in Tel Aviv. He began his career in research on the rise of Nazism at the Holocaust and Genocide Center, and he's currently a fellow at the Jewish People Policy Institute based in Jerusalem. In addition, he has a frequent column for the Jerusalem Post. Over the years, Sam has worked in various research institutes such as the Institute for Monitoring Peace and Cultural Tolerance in School Education, the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, and UN Watch. He edited Dr. Einat Wilf's book, We Should All Be Zionists, and is currently working on his own first book that will focus on the role of Islamism and the Israeli Palestinian conflict and the Nazi Islamist relationship. Sam runs a highly informative and eloquent Instagram page, and he also has a Substack you can subscribe to where you can read his writing. It was Amy Albertson that suggested that I bring Sam on, and I'm so grateful because I found him to be a fantastic guest. I don't know how all of you are feeling, but I'm personally starting to reach a point where I no longer want to tolerate dialogue or conversation with misinformed people. And I'm specifically talking about dialogue here, where somebody wants to hear my response or my opinion to what they said. I'm not talking about having guests on the podcast that I disagree with, and I'm the one trying to learn their position on things. I'm talking about friends, acquaintances, coworkers, anyone in our lives who expects us to offer a rebuttal or a response to something that they said. That is the type of dialogue with misinformed people that I'm referring to. There are some fundamental truths that are not negotiable, and I don't want to negotiate them with misinformed people anymore. For example, a fundamental truth: anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. Denying Jews the right to self-determination, which is all that Zionism is, that's anti-Semitic. There's no need to ask people, well, what's your definition of Zionism? Because there is a definition of Zionism. We don't get to define our definition of Zionism. There is just Zionism. So trying to talk to people who say, well, that's not how Zionism manifests, like all of that is irrelevant. The fundamental truth is a fundamental truth. Second fundamental truth is that Zionism is a core tenet of Judaism and the Jewish people. You cannot be Jewish and not be Zionist. And here specifically, I'm talking about the types of Jews who don't support Zionism for political or ideological reasons. I'm not referring to like the ultra-religious Satmar Jews who have a theological basis for why they don't support people living in the current state of Israel. And even then, like, that's almost kind of not anti-Zionist because they do believe that Jews should live in Israel. They just believe that Jews should not live in Israel until Mashiach comes. So it's not like they're anti-Israel. They're just like, I guess, anti-Israel right now? ? I know there are highly left-leaning, progressive Jewish people that refer to themselves as anti-Zionists. But that doesn't mean that that's a valid take. Lots of people can refer to themselves as lots of different things. But again, it doesn't mean that that's a valid thing to say. Since my time in college, I've been trying to have dialogue and conversation, and I still will have dialogue and conversation. But I just refuse to act like some of these beliefs and positions are valid. But also, I think it's very dangerous when people, Jewish people, and especially Jewish organizations, quote unquote, create space to normalize invalid beliefs. I've said this probably 100 times. We don't normalize that the earth is flat just because some people think the earth is flat. And we shouldn't normalize believing harmful and false things about Zionism and the Jewish people. So how does this relate to Sam? Well, considering Sam is an expert on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and especially Islamism, in this episode, he helps us articulate the truth of it. What is the reality of the situation, right? Because the faster we accept the reality of the situation, all of us, and stop validating invalid beliefs, the faster we can get to peace. And this is exactly what Sam is an expert at. I'll also add that Sam's position on the base reality of the situation is widely supported by other experts in this field, especially centrist experts. And I think it's more important than ever to hear from centrists right now. Listening to Sam speak will empower you to have the language, the vocabulary needed to bring someone you're debating or discussing Israel-Palestine with back to earth. Because this is such a sensitive topic, I know that there are many educated Jewish people out there who are simply too scared to fight back or debate or stand their position because they are worried that they'll say something wrong or in the wrong language, and then that incorrect statement will haunt them forever. With that in mind, I hope that you see this particular episode as the ammunition that you need to face the next conversation, to face the next dialogue, fearlessly and prepared. Please enjoy this episode. Hello, Samuel. Welcome to People Jew Wanna Know podcast. How are you today?
I'm good. Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
I'm very excited to chat with you. I have already learned so much from following your content, and I'm excited to hear your opinions and takes, especially on the current landscape. My first question for you is, tell us about yourself. What do you do, and how did you get there?
Yeah. All right. Well, I was born in South Africa. I grew up there, and I went to a Jewish school. So I grew up very much in the Jewish bubble. And I remember, I think it was the 8th grade, I got offered a scholarship for sport to go to another school, which wasn't Jewish. And that was really my first encounter with anti-Semitism. Before, I'd been very much secluded into the community. All my friends were Jewish. Obviously, my family was Jewish. And I remember my first encounter with it drew me to realizing immediately from that age the kind of conspiratorial element behind it. Two of my friends at the time would make constant jokes every day at school that my father somehow owned their fathers financially and everything like this. Now, what was ironic and funny about this in a way was that they were very aware that at that particular time in my life, my family was financially struggling. And they knew that. They knew that we were financially struggling. And yet, on repetition, there was this constant reference to being Jewish, having some sort of financial power and control over the non-Jewish people that I was surrounded by. So that was really my first encounter with it. And I did land up actually going back to the Jewish school after about a year and a half of being there. Not really because of anti-Semitism, but because the non-Jewish school I was at was an all-boys school. And I was used to kind of a co-ed education system. But I went on, studied political theory, actually started political science, and that to me didn't make sense. Kind of, for me, politics is human nature in its essence. And there was something about political science that felt like trying to impose maths on psychology to me, if that makes sense. So I moved over to political theory. And that's really what I wanted to be. I wanted to be an intellectual and theorize on politics and the political landscape of the time. But I had a very definitive change in my life, and that was when I got offered a job at the Holocaust Center. And through that, I traveled to Poland. Oddly enough, this change for me was not necessarily walking through Auschwitz or Birkenau or going through the gas chambers, and it also wasn't some spiritual epiphany or awakening of that nature. But really what it was attending service at the great Warsaw Synagogue, which seats about 400, 500 people. And the reason this was so transformative to me is about a year before this trip, I'd met a Holocaust survivor. Her name was Miriam, and her husband was the chazan, the cantor at the synagogue. And she told me all these stories about how the 400 or 500 seats were constantly packed, Friday nights, Saturdays, every Chag. And there were always people on the streets because there weren't enough seats listening to her husband singing. And when I got there, it was Shavuot, been at Auschwitz the day before. And we sat there for 3 hours because we couldn't get a minyan. Now, there was me and 4 other people on this trip. Then there was the rabbi and the chazan. So that they couldn't even bring in 3 people from the community in order to establish a minyan. And eventually the service was canceled. And that was really my first encounter with the reality of the Holocaust, right? It was the aftermath of the destruction of Europe's largest Jewish community. And in many ways, that made me focus my attention from the past, because at that time, for a 4-year period, I'd been studying the rise of the Nazi phenomena and the cultural and intellectual climate that prepared Europe for those most terrible crimes, look towards the present and the future. And the present and the future of Jewish life was, of course, the center of that was Israel. And in many ways, it was that moment in the synagogue which led me to making Aliyah. And I've been living in Israel for many years now. It also led to a shift in focus in Korea. I moved away from studying Nazism and the Holocaust and working in that field to working on Middle East affairs and the Israeli Palestinian conflict and Jewish life in the Middle East. So I'd say that's probably the best summary of how I got to where I am.
Talk to me about your fellowship with the Jewish People Policy Institute. You spoke at the beginning on how it was strange for you to study politics when you felt like it didn't account for human nature. And it kind of reminds me of what I studied, which was behavioral science, which looks at why people behave irrationally in a predominantly economic setting, like behavioral economics. And then the same way economics needs to account for irrational behavior, so does politics. What are you working on now at the Jewish People Policy Institute? Is it fair to call it JPPI? Yeah. JPPI. And are you able, do you think, to influence politics by looking at human behavior, especially in a place like Israel?
Yeah. Well, I think what I meant by that is that at bottom, political science believes that it's the study of institutions, right? So that institutions affect people. And I generally believe that the institutions are the reflection of the people. And that's part of political theory. That's part of apolitical theory, right? So the study of institutions itself wasn't particularly interesting to me when it came to politics. I was more interested in what crafts those institutions, about ideas and ideologies and different theologies and how people's beliefs and different cultures and societies are represented in the basic impulses of their political life. So at JPPI, I very much engage with that. Even though I live in Tel Aviv, it's based in Jerusalem. I go through there and work there. And we have many departments there's about 40 of us in the think tank, right? So it's not that big. It's very small. But there's different departments and different fellows focus on different things. For example, I'm very interested in Islamism and Jihadism and the role that plays in shaping the Israeli Palestinian conflict and being essentially the cornerstone barrier to peace. So that's mainly what I'm focusing on. And that really does go back to what I was speaking about, where I was saying, I believe that cultures and societies and ideas, political ideas and people, that influences the institutions and the dynamic of institutions that exist rather than the institutions influencing the dynamic of people. At JPPI, we are a private institute. We are not affiliated with government, although we do occasionally work with government. The one example, in Israel, there was a big crisis before October 7th, the judicial crisis, in which the government was seeking to pass judicial legislation, in essence, to overhaul the judiciary, to remove the checks and balances on the government, on the Supreme Court, to institute more authority for themselves. That created a huge crisis here. Now, one of the big problems in Israel is that the state doesn't actually have a constitution. So some of the fellows at my institute, I'm not included in this because I don't have any expertise in constitutional law, but some of the fellows at my institute, as well as experts in constitutional law from other institutes and from outside, have all gotten together and over the last year have been working, in essence, on something called a thin constitution, basically laying out the fundamental framework of what a constitution for the state could be. And then they will take that framework to government ministers and they will go and then sell it to them, convince them where the possibility of this could lie in state policy, why it's necessary. So surely, I've advised certain members of the Knesset in the opposition parties, that would be the center and the left-wing parties, prior to this election and prior to the war, I had advised them on certain things. So we're involved in shaping policy for Israel and the Jewish people, but we are not affiliated to any sort of political body or any sort of governmental body.
I like that. I think it can help maintain intellectual integrity in the process. And that's actually one of the things we've been talking about more often on the podcast with my guest is, especially in America, where Jewish life is kind of governed by Jewish nonprofits, when you are at the will of your donors or at the will of certain government bodies, whatever it be, there becomes this incentive to meet their interests as opposed to the interests of the customer you claim that you serve. I was curious to ask you about radical Islamism and radical extremism and how it influences the situation in the Middle East. One of the things that I've talked extensively about myself and with various guests is that progressives, at least in America, tend to prescribe democratic Western values and aspirations onto the Palestinian society. Values of democracy, values of freedom, rights for all peoples, including, for example, LGBTQ, something that notably is highly prohibited in Palestinian society. Just this assumption from the progressives that this is what Palestinian people would want. And it's very far from how Palestinian society actually operates. And if you talk to people, it's not necessarily how they want to operate. And this idea that if there were a Palestinian state, that it would be a democracy is really far from reality when Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. It's unlikely for a Palestinian state to become a democracy, given how culture and society operates in the larger Middle East. Is there any way to compel progressives to stop pushing for this dead-end ideal? Because I think firstly, it's not indicative of reality, but it actually denies Palestinians the rights to choice and agency. It mutes them from what they might actually want. That's the biggest hypocrisy in the world, because progressives are trying to provide rights and freedoms and agency to Palestinian people, but at the same time, they're stripping them by failing to listen to them.
Yeah, well, what I'll say is I think the conversation of Palestinian democracy is actually one that's more rooted in kind of the classic liberal approach, more so than it is the relationship between progressives and the Palestinian cause. What I mean by that is when you actually listen to the progressives and what they speak about in relation to the Palestinians, they're more speaking about like revolutionary principles, right? They impart this kind of revolutionary idea onto the Palestinians that the Palestinians represent an anti-imperialist struggle, when in fact, especially a movement like Hamas, which is an Islamist organization, their political program is very much literally part of trying to reestablish the caliphate, which is an imperial project. So I think the democracy idea is kind of been classic democratic American politics. It's been conventional wisdom that the right way to go about getting peace is to get a Palestinian state that is democratic. That makes sense, but I'm not, I don't possess the authority to speak on behalf of the Palestinians on what system should govern them. If they want to be governed by some sort of constitutional monarchy or something like Jordan, like the Hashemite kingdom, well, that's fine by me as long as it's a peaceful state. I don't really care what the actual system of governance they use is, but it certainly can't be one that's Islamist or jihadist. But I think that the progressives here are not really interested in the Palestinians being democratic. I think the progressives are interested in the Palestinians being almost a canvas for their own revolutionary ideals. So that's what I would answer to that. I'm not sure exactly who you're speaking about. I'm sure this is not the case for all people that identify as progressive. But certainly when it comes to academia and when it comes to the progressive activist movements, they're not engaging with this in any sort of good faith system here of trying to understand who Hamas is, what they represent, where they come from, what is their worldview, and what do they believe. They rather impose what they want Hamas and the Palestinians to represent onto them, which is why you see all these contradictory outcomes between their position and what reality is.
Thank you so much. And tell me a little bit more about how you think we can start to unwind the radicalization of Palestinian society and what we can do, because it seems like we are very far from any peace, any transition phase, any day after plan even. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think any real notion of peace here, realistically, is pretty much a long-term project. And I say that not just because of the immense human tragedy of the past year. It really goes deeper to that. And I think that I was even inclined when you asked me that to just jump to the end and start giving policy ideas or proposals like that. But I think that's part of the problem. I think a lot of the time we create ideas without even questioning the very stories on which these ideas are supposed to deal with. What I mean by that is that this is not and has never really been a conflict between two peoples, Israelis and Palestinians fighting over a territory that one sees as Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, and the other sees as historic Palestine. I mean, if you want to understand the issue, truly understand it, you always have to go back to an issue's roots. And that means really asking the right historical questions about the circumstances in which this conflict emerged. Through doing that, through understanding this, which I'll take us on this little story, only then can we start to get to processes of how we can see this story winding and de-radicalizing. Over time, I've come to see the origins of this conflict really tracing back to what could be described as like an Islamic identity crisis, which essentially begins with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, which is at around about the same time that the Zionist movement is gaining political traction and making political inroads. And that crisis was, and it still is, about the perception of Islam's decline. So the empire, the great empire, has now collapsed. And the Islamists in particular, they now are birthed because this movement of Islamism is birthed as an answer to that crisis. Right? And their vision is about restoring the past strength of the Muslim world by reestablishing that last caliphate. And the reason why that's important to understand is because at the center of Islam, Islam attaches its legitimacy to the concept of power or temporal success. Right? Islam believes, like Judaism, that there's a God and that God has a plan for history, that everything is predetermined. And it attaches its significance and its legitimacy to that plan through the concept of power. So if it's powerful in history, meaning if it's, let's say, conquering territories, building empires, then Islam itself is legitimate. It is in line with God's divine plan. Then the logical conclusion is that if those empires collapse, then it's not just what happened to us, to our empire, how did we lose our empire, but it's how did we lose legitimacy? How did we lose God's divine favor? How have we veered from God's historical trajectory? Those questions birth the Islamist movement, and their answer is to restore the past strength, the old piety of Islam, by reestablishing the last caliphate. Now, here's where Israel becomes central to that crisis. In Islamic tradition, the Jews are historically seen as weak, okay? But now they're attempting to be sovereign. That's why the leader of the Palestinian movement at the time, Hajj Amin al-Husseini, says Zionism is creating a reality in which the Jews have forgotten that they are dhimmi, which is second-class status according to Islam, and wards to Islam. So now the Jews have a state, a powerful one, in what was once considered the house of Islam, Dar al-Islam. For the Islamists, that's not acceptable. It's an existential humiliation, okay? It further proves their weakness that they're trying to fight against, right? If a people that are seen as powerless can establish a state on what they consider to be sacred Muslim land, then their entire mission to restore the glory of Islam and to never surrender Muslim territory or territory previously conquered by Islam, which Palestine, of course, once was, is a failure. And the continuation of Israel is a continuation of that weakness. That's why you see a multi-front war after October 7th. That's why the regime in Iran, the Houthis, Hezbollah, and Hamas pour billions upon billions into destroying Israel, because Israel's very existence represents an intolerable crisis of weakness for Islam in their idea. So when people frame this as a conventional national conflict, two sides fighting over a territory, we completely miss the point at what birthed the crisis and what has ensured its continuation. Now, there is the Islamist factions of the Palestinian movement. This isn't a political issue for them, it's theological. And that's how they very much see themselves, as the tip of that spear, right? So now, when I speak about this, people panic and say, well, does this then mean that this is a religious conflict? And I go back to something I said about stories and ideas earlier. Well, it's only a religious conflict if you never question the story of the Islamists, which I've just presented to you about power and strength and restoration, right? It's only religious if you believe that the Islamists represent the worldview and is all-encompassing of Islam as a faith. I don't believe that. Now, it's true that politically the Islamist narrative in certain parts in the Muslim world has certainly dominated. But the reason why I say it's not religious in its essence is because if you study Islamism, then you see two things happening. Firstly, yes, it is an outcome of Islam, rooted in Islam, but it's also very much a 20th century political totalitarian outcome whose worldview, whose politics, and whose relationship to the Jews in particular has been significantly influenced by European fascist ideologies, particularly Nazism, very deeply entrenched there. And more so when you look at other parts of the Muslim world, then you see a shift is happening, right? Particularly in the Gulf, countries like the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Bahrain. They rejected the Islamist worldview that I've just described. So therefore, it cannot be all-encompassing of the faith, and therefore is not, in its essence, just a religious conflict. But, this is important because Saudi is the protector of Mecca and Medina, the birthplace and the centerpieces of Islam. So it can't be all-encompassing of the faith. But when you look at that, then you start and you realize this transformation that's been happening in the UAE and Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries with rejecting Islamism, with outlawing the Muslim Brotherhood, of which Hamas is a chapter, with removing them from their soil, imprisoning people that are taking part in Islamist movements and terrorist entities, declaring all these organizations. The UAE has declared British-born Muslim Brotherhood organizations as terrorist organizations. They're illegal in the UAE and legal in the UK. So what has the side effects now been of the rejection of this worldview? If we take my claim at face value that worldview that is birthed by the Islamists is one centerpiece that really births this conflict, well, then isn't it interesting that the minute that these countries started rejecting that worldview of Islam, rejecting that body politics of Islamism and the violent and those willing to violently carry out the cause, which are the jihadists, well, the collateral benefit of that was basically the Abraham Accords. All of that helped create the condition for the Abraham Accords. If the conflict is being fought regionally on multiple fronts, as it has been historically and as it certainly was now in this last war, then peace initiatives will have to be solved and directed on a regional basis. So basically what I'm saying is we always have to question the stories that we're dealing with the conflict here to even be able to solve it. And I think we have a blueprint, that was from the Abraham Accords. Whether it continues to succeed, let's say with the Saudi deal, depends on many things: political interests, motivations on behalf of multiple different parties. But here's really the main point that I'm hitting home. When you remove that specific form of fanaticism, Jihadi Islam, then we can finally begin talking about this conflict in more conventional terms. Only then can we start understanding how territory can be divided, how resources can be shared. Only then can Jews and Arabs start looking at each other in the eyes, Jews and Muslims, and see that maybe it's better to build a future together based on wealth than a future together based on war. But it is through the repudiation of jihadism and the outlawing of Islamism that the countries willing to do that with Israel have been able to do that. So that's the story that we need to be questioning. And the way in which we do that is we look at America and we look at the European countries who are funding these organizations in various different ways. For example, the Palestinian Authority's education curricula, you can pick up any of their textbooks, any grade, any subject, and you will find the promotion of jihad, the glorification of martyrdom, the rejection of peace as a concept of weakness, right? Now, Europe and America are funding these textbooks. So you got to take the approach that the Saudis and the Emiratis took. They completely reformed their education curriculum, completely. I mean, the reform was significant. The Jews went from being spoken about as foreign colonial invaders or some conspiracy to destroy Islam to the children of Abraham, kin to this region, the cousins of Muslims, right? All of this happened in the years leading up to the Abraham Accords. So peace is not impossible even when dealing with this concept of Islam, but we have to get rid of the Islamist project. And the way to do that is to cut off the funding of the Muslim Brotherhood and their frameworks and organizations that they've spread throughout the region and, in fact, throughout the world. And if the Europeans and the Americans are all serious about any concept of a two-state solution, well, then they're going to have to stop funding the very things that prevent that. That's really the first step in the process.
This is amazing. I really love how you broke down the narratives that shape how we've seen history unfold. And this is also consistent with any subject matter expert that I've spoken to that studies the Middle East, like even Shama Mishtali, who I had on the podcast, in very similar language, talks about these narratives, and also talks about the importance of Abraham Accords and looking at UAE and Saudi Arabia as examples of countries that have come around.
Yeah. Look, I mean, the UAE and Saudi Arabia have their own issues. I mean, there's not exactly countries in which I would want to go and live.
Yeah.
I prefer to live in an open, free society that's a democracy, right? That's also not to say that Israel's perfect. It's certainly not. But certainly it's not for us to dictate the political systems of other countries if those countries are going to be peaceful and engaging in good faith with the world. Well, then that's fine. But at its very core, any sort of Islamist governance or jihadist organization is at its core not compatible with being peaceful. The ideology itself is not compatible with being peaceful. It's like, that's why I'm saying you have to repudiate it and get rid of it. It's like, you can deal with Viktor Orban, for example, in Hungary, who's, certainly not a liberal, okay, to put it lightly, but you couldn't deal with Viktor Orban in the same way that you dealt with Hitler and Nazism, right? That's the component. I'm not at all comparing Orban to Hitler. I'm making the discretion. I'm saying Orban's not exactly the most liberal democratic person in the world, but the ideology in which, he's running with there, he's not looking to attack other people. His entire politics isn't based off that. He's not looking to wage wars. This is in total contrast to Hitler's ideology, which Nazism was imperial and expansionist in nature and had its central conspiracy of Jewish world domination. You have to know who you're dealing with here. You mentioned Shama. I was just with Shama actually in Berlin about 2 weeks ago, or we got back about a week ago, I think a week ago exactly now, with a whole bunch of people from Bahrain and Egypt and Hamza Khawidi from Gaza and people that are living in the West now, but who were born and grew up in Syria and Iraq and Iran, all looking at this issue from the different angles that we come from. We all agree that it's the cornerstone issue that requires addressing. And I think let's not kid ourselves that the best possible thing that could happen here is that an Israeli prime minister and a Palestinian leader get into a room and sit down at a negotiating table for a two-state solution. This is not going to happen. Even if it does happen, I very much doubt that it's going to lead to peace unless it is facilitated through the region, right? Unless it's facilitated through the region. But kind of a repetition of Oslo or Camp David is not going to happen because it's just not going to address the fundamental problems here. So it's a long-term process, and we have to kind of accept that, and we have to start building up the framework in which that can be dealt with. And that starts with people who are from our side, from the Jewish and Israeli side, who are interested in peace, not deluding themselves, because a lot of people in the peace camp, for example, delude themselves as to what the problems actually are, right? And that's not to say that the issues that they speak about, like the military occupation in the West Bank, or, for example, the settlements, aren't problems. I have many issues, in particular with the settlements, which is a separate topic that we can discuss if you want to. But we need to be really sober about the true nature of the problem here if we are to solve it, is basically the message that I have for anyone who's interested in that.
This whole conflict and just politics in general, it's very complex because at any given time, one decision influences a web of other things. And so the plan is there, right? The theory, the thought leadership of how to start working towards peace or whatever is there. We know the formula to follow. Unfortunately, there are so many moving parts in all societies that our politicians, when they pull one thread, they unravel 15 other threads somewhere else. And it seems insurmountable. It's almost like the opportunity has to present itself and someone has to observe that the opportunity is there, because it's so hard to try to maneuver the opportunity into appearing. It just has to kind of present itself and someone has to seize it. But I don't know if you agree.
I agree to an extent. I think that the frameworks for peace are there. My thing is that the frameworks for peace are not there on the Palestinian side. And that is not me making the claim that there's no Palestinian who believes in the existence of the state of Israel. I do not possess the ability to enter the hearts and minds of millions of people and know exactly what they think. I have no idea. What I do know is that the fundamental driving idea of these movements, the thing that represents the basic impulses of Palestinian politics, is the rejection of Jewish sovereignty in any part of the land, and that there has never, ever been, not once, any considerable peace movement or dissenting voice for peace in the times where the Israelis and the Palestinians, through the Americans, sat down at the negotiating table, for example, and the Palestinians were offered a two-state solution at Camp David 1 and 2 and Taba. All these instances in which a state was offered to the Palestinians with ending the occupation, no settlements in the state of Palestine, a capital in East Jerusalem, it was all rejected. There's a whole bunch of excuses as to why it was rejected. Most of them are made up from the perspective of what the excuses Arafat gives. What's actually more telling about the rejection and more telling about the problem is not that Arafat and later Abbas rejected these peace deals. Oddly enough, the Palestinians are not even the worst offenders of rejecting peace deals in the history of the world. Plenty parties in conflict are going to be quite, obstinate when it comes to stuff like that. What is totally unique to the Palestinians, however, is that when Arafat and when Abbas years later, rejected those accords, there was a total absence of voices from within Palestinian society, of Palestinian intellectuals, right? Academics, intellectuals, thought leaders, journalists, of activist movements, or actual opposition, political opposition, meaning different parties within the PLO framework or whatever it is, that dissented against that and said, what are you doing? Return to the negotiating table and secure our state. We want a state. There's the state. There was no dissent. They celebrated rejecting it and then waged the second intifada. So this is why I think it's just a hopeless endeavor to just think, to follow kind of, even some of the Israeli peace camp models today still follow this formula. Right. And that's why I say, you want to solve the problem? Let's be sober about the problem.
This is an interesting time to pick your brain about the settlements and the West Bank, because it's kind of related in that a lot of the criticism I see, for better or for worse, at least in the West, is like, okay, well, just look at the West Bank. It's not working either. And the interesting thing is, I actually lived on a settlement, which I don't think anybody knows. I lived in a town called Ariel, which is a settlement town. It's in the West Bank. And there were years, I've been there many times. I lived there for one summer. There were years that I would visit and we'd have to wear bulletproof vests stacked like a book on top of the child's car seat. And when I visited my cousin, we could only walk around, on a certain radius, and we could not leave that radius. And it was a big problem if we left that radius. And so I'd always go on walks with her because I couldn't really go by myself. God forbid anything happened. But I'm actually not super familiar with what the stream of consciousness is around the West Bank. I understand that there are problems there, obviously. I think maybe this is like insensitive of me, but there are problems to solve, right? And all problems and all misbehavior matters. It's just some matters more and some matters less. And so when I view these criticisms of Israel, well, what about the West Bank? And what about this? And what about that? It is all true, and it matters less in light of everything else that is happening in the country right now and the challenges that Israel and the society are up against. Yeah. I would love to hear your thoughts on West Bank and how you think it plays into the current conflict.
Yeah, well, as I said, I don't think that the settlements are the obstacle to peace. I mean, I kind of briefly mentioned that. But that's probably also why I'm a good person to say why I think they're not in Israel's best interest. Because I don't look at the settlements as an issue with the conflict, right? People get very attached to this idea, well, the anti-Israel crowd attack that, therefore we must support it. There's kind of this reactionary politics. Well, that's not the issue, and then you go in defense of that. But I think that the Jewish community at large need to, especially now, because we're definitely going through a crisis that we haven't gone through in quite some time, really need to get back to asking themselves one fundamental question. And everything should begin from this question, and then all the arguments that are inherent to being Jewish can go from there. And that question is, what is in the best interest of Israel, and by extension, the Jewish people in the 21st century? That should be our approach to every problem that we're solving, right? Here's what I see. The settlements are not an issue when it comes to solving the conflict. If the settlements were the big thing, we would have had peace. So these have all been laid out in the peace accords. However, there is a reality here. in that there are 2 million Arabs inside Israel, over 2 million. There's over 3 million in the West Bank and another 2 million in Gaza. So that's about 7 million from the river to the sea, Arabs. And there's 7 million Jews, which is about 50-50. Now, was the purpose of the Zionist movement not to create a Jewish state for the Jewish people where the Jews are majority? I think it was. I think that the Zionists disagreed on many things, but there were three fundamental principles that they didn't disagree on. Jewish state, democratic, secure borders. Now, I'll tell you why the settlements interfere with all three of those. The first one I've already started touching on, the Jewish majority. Well, if you want a Jewish state from the river to the sea, well, number one, okay, it's already sitting at 50-50 Jews and Arabs. So you've lost your majority. And no one in the world can point you to a successful example of a state where you had two ethnic majorities basically veering for a territory. You're basically dealing with Lebanon, the situation that happened with the Lebanon civil war. So that's number one. Number two, the Palestinian birth rate is higher than the Haredi birth rate. So that 50-50 is not going to last for very long. The Jews will eventually find themselves as a minority between the river and the sea. And when in history can anyone point me to one example in which the Jews living as a minority in the Arab world or even in Europe led to the kind of life that we get to live today in the state of Israel as a majority, as a sovereign people? No, you can't point me to that example, right? It doesn't exist. To fantasize that this state from the river to the sea, being an Arab majority state, will somehow be democratic and therefore treat its Jews as citizens is to ignore the ideology of the Palestinian cause and its ideology and why it opposes a Jewish state in any borders in the first place. And secondly, is to bet your future, to relinquish Jewish self-determination in a nation state of our own, to relinquish that under an imaginary hope that this state from the river to the sea will somehow be the first Arab democracy. There's no historical precedent for that. So now you're dealing with, okay, right, fine. So that's your Jewish element. Now what's your democratic element? Okay, let's say it's 50-50 or 40-60. It eventually lands up at 40-60. Let's take that case scenario. Because when you're dealing with reality, you have to look at all sides of this. You can't convince yourself of a fantasy. You also have to look at the downfalls of this. So let's say the Jews land up being 40% or 45% between the river and the sea. But they want to maintain a Jewish state over the Arab majority. Well, what does that sound like? Well, that sounds like apartheid. So then you might as well, okay, just make all the wish of the Free Palestine movement. Like these people, in essence, you're basically being a propaganda tool for these people by advocating for anything like that. Because that's what they're falsely accusing you of. And now you're saying the way to solve this is to create that as a reality. Right? So it's totally delusional. You're not starting from the point of asking yourself, what is in our best interest? You're merely reacting to the anti-Semites and what they're accusing you of. And then the third thing is secure borders. Before October 7th, 75% of Israel's on-the-ground military was deployed into the West Bank. Now, what does that mean? It means that 25% of our troops deployed were spread across 6 other border fronts, 4 of which have jihadist lunatics with a genocidal concept of the Jews on the other side of that border. It's not by accident, okay, that we have one of the best armies in the world, and yet somehow Hamas could penetrate through the border for hours, go unchallenged. Why? Because there were not enough military there. Why? Because the military were all stationed in the West Bank, and even more military had been sent to the West Bank 2 nights before, because there had been violent riots between Israeli settlers and Palestinians, because Israeli settlers decided to go and set up a sukkah in the middle of Hawara, which is a violent town where there's always clashes. And they did it specifically to cause friction, and that landed up in a riot. And all the military, a whole bunch of military that were deployed to Gaza was sent there to go do that. So now we left people, think about this, that we didn't realize how extensive the tunnels were. But at the time, the estimates were 300 miles of military tunnels, 200 feet underground. We knew the rocket capabilities that they have. And we know that they have a genocidal desire against the Jews. And yet we left those borders vulnerable to protect the settlers because they insist on living in enemy territory. This is ridiculous. This is a security policy based on a lie. Let's be honest about it. It's a security policy based on a lie, right? The settlements do not bring Israel security. They were originally established under the Alon plan after the 67 war in order to create a barrier. But here's how seriously you should take that plan. At the same time the Alon plan was being established, all the security aspects were speaking to the Arab world and saying, we're prepared to trade the territory for peace. No, the settlements have nothing to do with security. They're an ideological movement, which was established by Rav Avraham Kook, which assigns messianic significance to the state. So now let's ask ourselves, it goes back to the thing of let's start questioning the ideas upon which the stories are built. So we've now started questioning these ideas. Well, what is the story? To understand religious Zionism, you have to understand that it starts off not within the Zionist movement, but on the outside of it in collaboration with it. And it starts off with the Mizrahi movement, not Mizrahi to be confused with Ashkenazi, but the Mizrahi religious Zionist movement with Rav Reins. And Rav Reins has actually got a very dovish political outlook, not interested in territory as much as he is on making sure that the secular state that the Zionists are seeking to establish has Jewish religious life and its principles embedded into the state. That's the birth. But after 67, religious Zionism undergoes a shift to another stage. And that's what we can call the Rav Kook framework, the Kookian framework. Rav Kook assigned messianic significance to the state. The state was not just the secular state, a state of Jewish sovereignty, but it was the very manifestation of God's will. And that God has commanded the Jews through prophecies, through Jeremiah, to settle the entire promised land. And through settling the entire promised land, the great messianic redemption will come. That's the idea of the settlements. Now, once you get the Gaza disengagement and handing over certain areas of the West Bank to the PA during the Oslo Accords and the disengagement from Sinai, peace with Egypt, which was late 70s, but the disengagement came in 82, that now starts to provide huge setbacks. The Kookian religious Zionists believe that once this process is set in motion, which 1967 was now the thing, there's no going back. And they see the state as this holy vehicle to achieve the redemption. But now, if the state is going back and is pulling back, then the state can no longer be the holy vessel. The state must now be a betrayer of that holy mission, which now fragments the entire religious Zionist community into a whole bunch of different sectors. You've got sectors that actually become quite progressive and liberal and start doing things, like a good example of this is the Shalom Hartman Institute. Quite progressive, quite liberal, religious Zionists nonetheless, right? On the other hand, many in the religious Zionist community stopped attaching messianic significance to the state. And then the blowback on that is two movements that are born, which are these movements who you see creating all the violence in the territories from outside of things, right? The anti-state Hardel and the so-called Hilltop Youth. Both these movements are very literally anti-Zionist movements because they reject the authority of the state of Israel. And in fact, the leader of the Hilltop Youth years ago, Meir Ettinger, was arrested in 2015 for not only his support for what was described as religious terrorism, but for having plans to try overthrow the secular Zionist state and replace it with a religious theocracy that he titled the State of Judea. So now I ask you, is that in the best interest of the Jews in the 21st century? Forget about the Palestinians for a moment. Right? And this speaks, and this is how I'll end it, to the bigger issue here, right? Zionism was successful because it was constructive. So when you look at the Zionist movement, the creation of the state of Israel, Israel's created at around the same time period as about 100 new other countries, right? Collapse of the empires and the birth of nation states. So not all in exactly the same year, but in that time period, post-World War II, 100 new states are born based on the principle of self-determination for a people, okay? The collapse of colonial empires. All peoples, Greeks, Armenians, Turks, Czechs, Bulgarians, and the Zionists, okay, were faced with a choice. Liberation through sovereignty in a nation state of your own, or continue to struggle over what you perceive as a much more just territorial outcome. All the people I just mentioned chose liberation through sovereignty. There was one group of people who chose to struggle for what they perceive as a more just territorial outcome. Their name is the Palestinians. Today, they are still stateless. Nothing has worked out for them in that regard through that struggle. Why on earth we would think copying that framework through the settlement movement is a good idea and not doing what we did, given we're the ones that have a successful state, is delusional to me. And it's the reason why we're at this point is from a place of resentment. We have very legitimate grievances, very legitimate resentments. Everything has become reactionary. All right, so they're targeting the settlements. We have to defend the settlements, right? For example, and we don't even ask ourselves, is this even in our best interest, right? Because the Zionists were successful not because of reactionary politics towards the Arab anti-Semites and the Arab regimes that wanted to wipe them out, okay? But because they simultaneously knew how to defend against them, attack where necessary, but also have a constructive political vision that was in the best interest of Israel and the Jewish people. That's where our success lies, not in this reactionary politics. So if there's one thing I'm concerned about American Jews when they look at Israel, it's not seeing that part of it, right? Because, and I understand it's very traumatic to be surrounded by this anti-Semitic environment now and the sentiment that exists. I by no means underplay that. I understand living in Israel, I have distance to that. I have to deal with the war and a different side of it, but I have distance to that. And I understand the trauma to that. But we need to ask ourselves now the question, what is in our best interest, and stop basing all our ideas and all our reactions on trying to oppose what those who hate us say.
That was excellent. Thank you so much. I'm curious to know if in the years of working in this and studying this, if there's something that you've changed your mind on.
Yeah, there's many things I've changed my mind on. I would say, in truth, I always saw the issue of Islamism as a huge problem in this conflict. But it was only after October 7th when I went and really went and questioned the stories that I believed in, and went and studied their story and what they believe and why they believe it, that I realized that kind of civilizational perspective to this conflict is the core issue here. That's one thing. The second thing is I used to be far more concerned when I was outside of Israel with the military occupation being a core issue. Since I got to Israel, not only for practical reasons of my life, but just through working in this more and experiencing things more, the occupation, like any occupation, is the result of the war. The military presence of the West Bank, that is an outcome. An occupation by definition, a military occupation by definition, is literally the result of a war, not the cause of a war. Right? So that's something I changed my mind on, seeing the significance of that. Not to negate the problems that come from that, but the significance of that. The other thing I changed my mind on, would consider myself a Chiloni Zioni, a secular Zionist, and I realized that I think before I had this idea that the best way in which Israel could move forward would be to return to secular Zionism at its core, meaning almost like a fully Jewish state, but when it comes to anything to do with religion, atheistic in principle on state institutions. I don't see that anymore as being a reality. I do think that there needs to be a separation between religion and state in Israel. I think that's very, very important. And I think that is the way in which you'll secure the freedom for all different groups to practice their religion. It will be through a secular state. But I've realized the power that religion holds for people who don't even believe in God in a very different way, right? What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is religion provides people with frameworks to understand life, to understand the world around them. It gives them comfort during crisis, right? You'll find many people, I mean, especially Jews, who attach great significance to performing Jewish rituals and yet don't believe in God. I'm not an atheist, but I'm just not sure about the existence or non-existence of, God. I'm just not sure. I don't concern myself with something I feel like I'm not going to know. It's nonetheless, I think that in Israel, there's going to need to be a rebalancing of that. And the other thing I think has been the other thing I said. I never used to approach the issues from that question of what is in the best interest of Israel and the Jews. Now, I can provide my answer, and people are obviously free to disagree with that. That's the whole point of having that fundamental question from which we can all base something off. But basically, the biggest life change for me was, don't just question ideas, question the very foundation of the stories upon which people have these ideas from. And from that, a lot changes. But as it stands, that's pretty much it.
And I'll just say that to question is a very Jewish thing in and of itself.
I always make a joke. I said to this rabbi here once, I said, if I consider myself agnostic, it's merely because Judaism led me there. And he laughed and he said, yeah, tell me how. I said, well, questioning is a principle of Judaism. It's a foundational principle of Judaism. And question everything is actually the foundational principle. All right, so I questioned the existence or non-existence of God. I came to a determined conclusion that there's no proof for the existence or non-existence. And I basically determined myself to be an atheist, an agnostic at that point, right? Not an atheist, an agnostic. I don't know. He found that rather funny. And I think that there's a lot of Jewish agnostics because of that. I think it's not by accident that a lot of Jews in the past, including the Zionists, a lot of the early Zionists were agnostics, based on similar principles of having, of deeply questioning as many things as you can.
There is a dimension of Judaism that requires a leap of faith. There are core Jewish principles, right, of questioning, of doing the mitzvot, of being a light upon the nations. And then one of those principles is a leap of faith is required. And that's the principle that conveniently gets overlooked because it's the most uncomfortable one. And it's the least rational one. But that is very much underscored, I would say, in religious interpretation of Jewish documents. Samuel, how can people connect with you on social media and learn more about your work?
Yeah, well, you can follow me on Instagram at samuelj.hyde. I basically use Instagram as my base page, right? It's got the links in my bio to all my different articles. I've also got a Substack, then all my content and whatever goes on there. So Instagram's kind of the base page from which I work. And then I always post my articles or anything that I write.
You are an excellent scholar, but also an excellent educator. I think you have a gift for conveying information to people and helping people reframe their beliefs in behavioral science. We call it debiasing. It's a big part of logical reasoning. And I'm excited. I think you're a fantastic voice and representative of our generation and the Jewish people at large. I have one final question for you. It's one that I ask every single guest of the podcast.
Fire away.
It's easy. Who would you like to nominate for People Jew Want to Know podcast?
Yeah, I thought about this actually all day. It could be interesting to interview. Do you know Blake Flayton?
Yes.
So Blake is a friend of mine. He's currently in America on a tour. He's just finished writing his first book, and it's 10 things every Jew should know before they go to campus, something like that. I can't remember the name of the book, but it's something to do with that. And he's just been he's still in America, but he's going to be there for, I think, another week or so. But he's going to be there. He's been there for 6 weeks, going around the country doing speaking tours to students. So now that could be interesting, speaking to someone who's just written a book on this issue. Because Blake, what I always say is Blake was there in May 2021 on campus. I mean, that's when Blake and my work, that's when our generation of things started coming through, right? Blake was very much there on ground zero from the get-go at campus. So for him to be there when the crisis was ignited, to now write a book when the crisis is really burning, and then have this moment to go and speak to a whole bunch of students about what he's learned over time. And he comes from Israel and he's going to serve in the IDF. So there's many things to speak to him about. And I always promote him because I think he deserves it.
This is a fantastic nomination. Thank you so much. It's been such a privilege to speak to you today and to learn from you. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please go ahead and rate us 5 stars. Be the first to hear our episodes by subscribing to People Jew Want to Know wherever you get your podcasts. And for exclusive content, follow us on Instagram at People Jew Want to Know.